Welcome to Little Notes on Big Questions. I'm Lindsay Schreiber. In this section of Little Notes, we have been discussing church history through the lens of denominational splits. We have been looking for the answer to what happened to cause the Christian faith to divide into so many directions that there are over 45,000 Christian denominations globally. As we have followed along the path of different splits, we have found that some churches were founded on doctrinal differences. Some were more a matter of polity, how they were going to do things procedurally. Sometimes there were splits because of issues that were going on in history. For example, war caused some denominations to split. Sometimes it was a geographical issue. But we have now arrived at one of the most personal splits in church history as far as the Church of God of Prophecy goes. In this lesson, we are going to answer the question, what happened to divide the Church of God into the Church of God and the movement I'm a part of, the Church of God of Prophecy. Before we get started, we need to do a quick review of the foundations of the Church of God, as that all plays into what happens in today's lesson. The birth of our movement can be traced back to Barney Creek Meeting House in Monroe County, Tennessee, in August of 1886. Here, a group led by Richard Sperling formed a new church called the Christian Union. The Christian Union sought to be a holiness church fully led by the Holy Spirit and free of man-made traditions. In 1896, a revival broke out at the Shearer Schoolhouse in Cherokee County, North Carolina. This group is one which had been acquainted with Sperling and his teachings and is considered a continuation of the Christian Union group. In 1902, the Shearer Schoolhouse group organized as the Church at Camp Creek. This organization was completed under Sperling and W.F. Bryant. Later, it was known as the Holiness Church at Camp Creek. On June 13, 1903, there was a scheduled time of worship and Bible study for the Holiness Church, and they invited an evangelist from Indiana named A.J. Tomlinson. During an intense time of solitary prayer atop Burger Mountain, Tomlinson received a vision of what the Church of God should be. When he came back down, he joined Sperling's church. But when he joined, he said, I am joining with the understanding that this is the Church of God. And that is how the name of that group suddenly changed to Church of God. In 1904, Tomlinson became the pastor of the Holiness Church at Camp Creek, and by the end of the next year, this church, now known as the Church of God, had expanded to 4 local congregations. The first Church of God assembly took place in January 1906 in Cherokee County, North Carolina. By 1922, the Church of God recorded 21,673 members. But by the end of the next year, 1923, Tomlinson's flock would be cut by 15,000 members. Now, of course, that was a very fast overview, just hitting the high points that are going to matter in tonight's lesson. If you want more details, please go back and catch that episode just a few weeks ago where I talked about the foundations of the Church of God. So, what is the reason that the church split? Why did the group under Tomlinson end up losing 15,000 members at once? There are 3 reported causes for the split. Now, of course, it's a matter of opinion. There are some people who would give you different answers. This was over 100 years ago now. So obviously, these people are not still around. So there is some debate on some of these, but I'm just going to share the 3 that I have read as reported causes. One cause has been listed as the discussion over divorce and remarriage. The subject of divorce and remarriage, and specifically if someone could be a member of the Church of God if they had been divorced and married again, was first brought up in the Third Assembly in 1908. There was much debate, but in the end it was decided that none who are remarried can be members unless they are the innocent party in cases of fornication or adultery. The subject was brought up again in the next assembly, and it was brought up again multiple times over the next few years. Now, to understand why the subject kept coming up, you need to know something about the way the Church of God was functioning at that time. The General Assembly was a gathering, at that time a yearly gathering of members of the church. We still have it now, but it's every 2 years. And in this gathering, members from now all over the world come together for messages and for business and for information to be shared. That now happens every 2 years. It used to happen every year. And one of the features back in the day was that any member could come forward and ask questions. And then those questions would be answered by Brother Tomlinson, who was the leader of the church. Originally, he answered all the questions. And they're really fascinating if you have access to read them. I have in my library many of those years. And they would be questions, for instance, like, one of my favorite questions, is it okay to go to the county fair? And the answer was something like, you can go to the agricultural shows, but you can't go to the sideshows. Or a question could be something like, can I sell Coca-Cola in my store? If you had like a family store, because soda in those glass bottles could look like alcohol. Those are the kind of questions that were asked. They were application questions of what the church teachings were. Brother Tomlinson would answer them. So the divorce or remarriage question kept coming up multiple years, sometimes because the committees were bringing them up, but more often because people were asking the questions. They just kept asking the same question over and over again. And when you read the answers, it makes sense because people weren't really getting clear answers. So continually, people would come and say, well, can a woman get married again if she's divorced? And they would try to answer it, but they kept coming up uneven on it because even the committee could not come into agreement about it. So it gets brought up for several years in a row. In 1913, a committee was formed to study the problem and bring their findings to the next assembly. But the committee could not reach a decision, and so it was tabled again. In 1915, the question came up again, and the church was divided equally. What's interesting is that year, when the church was divided, Brother Tomlinson didn't want to move forward because he saw what was on the line with that type of division. And he actually offers to step down from his role as general overseer because it felt like, well, maybe he can't lead if he can't get everybody into agreement on the subject. Of course, he didn't know it would be a continued argument for 100 years. Now, one thing that's important to understand is in Sperling's founding of the church, when he was back in those Christian Union days, one of the really important aspects, we talked about this in the previous lesson, was that the Church of God was meant to be a place where people could value their own conscience, where we weren't going to have to tell everybody how to live. The idea is that if we are all living a holiness lifestyle and if the Holy Spirit is working through us, then we should be able to let people have liberty in things that were non-essentials. And ideally, in the essentials, we would all come into what's called one accord, that the Holy Spirit would not speak something different to different ones of us if it was a matter that really was important. Well, now he's up against, we can't all agree. We can't figure out how to agree on this subject. And so it was an issue that kept coming up over and over again. Brother Tomlinson addressed the issue in 1922 in his annual address, and I'm going to read to you a quotation and see if you can see why there was so much confusion on the topic. The subject of divorce and remarriage has been hanging over the church without a settlement or an agreement for many years. There are reasons to believe that it has hung in this quiet manner long enough. We cannot afford to ignore one point of teaching in the Bible much longer. The ban must be removed so that men and women may speak their convictions on the subject. But how much better will it be for all to leave this assembly speaking the same thing on this subject than for them to go away divided and one preacher preach it one way and one another? Let it be fornication for a man to marry a woman who has a living husband instead of the act of adultery. I do believe we should consider removing the bar, which has been on the subject so long, and give a chance for both parties to teach it as they see it, even if it does cause some confusion. We must open the subject some way before our people so they may be able to consider both sides of the question. So in that address, which would be, you can compare it to when the president gives the State of the Union address, but it's a message, it's a sermon. In that address, it seems like he's trying to find, I know we don't like that word compromise, but that's kind of what it's sounding like. And he's trying to define the difference between the words fornication and adultery, which is really at the root of a lot of the confusion on the subject. He's also trying to lean back on those earlier principles of we should be able to let people to a certain degree live to what the Holy Spirit is convicting in them on certain subjects. So it was a continued issue. I will say it has been contested whether or not this was really a clear cause in the split within the Church of God. And I think one of the reasons that it is sometimes blamed is because when you go back and look at the committees that were researching it, you see the same names on those committees as the names that become major players in the other issues we're about to discuss. The second issue, the second cause for the split, and this really is the most important, and I think this is the one that most people who've studied our history would agree was the real cause of the split. It was a debate over theocratic government. The church was meant to be a theocratic government, meaning one which is ruled neither by democracy nor oligarchy, but by God himself. An oligarchy is defined as a small group of people having control over a country, organization, or institution. The church was not a democracy. It was not meant for there to be votes on everything that had, and everybody can just, although we were saying that your conscience is important and your personal convictions are important, we also knew that when it came to doctrine, that we weren't taking votes on things and just saying, well, majority will rule. We also were not trying to be that oligarchy where a small group was going to make all the decisions. We were not a representative republic where people can send in votes. Again, that would be similar to democracy. We were supposed to be a theocracy where God was in control. The General Assembly, that body of covenant members present at the General Assembly, had consistently been referred to as, quote, not being legislative or executive, but judicial only. This had always been the way of thinking of our founders. If you know anything about the U.S. government, there are three branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches. The legislative branch in government is the one that makes the laws. They write the laws. If you are an American, that would be the Congress, the House, and the Senate. The executive branch in our government is the President of the United States. The executive branch is charged with executing the laws, enforcing the laws. The judicial branch, which would be the judges, most highly in our country, the Supreme Court, who interpret the law. Judges, the people in the judicial branch, are not permitted to write law. They can only interpret what the law already states. So in the church could not be legislative. They could not write the laws because the Bible already made the law. The church could not be executive, enforcing the laws, because Jesus is the head of the church, and that lies on him. The church must be judicial, simply interpreting the law which already exists. This idea was clearly defined in the First Assembly of 1906. One of the things that there was never question about in our history was that we are supposed to be a theocracy, and that the General Assembly that would be the ones to approve doctrine and approve procedures and polity could only be judicial, that it could only interpret what the Bible already said. Well, everything was about to change. In 1916, the church had gone from one church of 20 members in 1903 to 230 churches, creating a membership of over 7,600. Brother Tomlinson saw how expansion created a need for more input. In 1915, Tomlinson proposed the establishment of a cabinet, or a body of counselors, who would function like a presidential cabinet. It would be a group of elders who worked closely with and advised the general overseer. He reiterated the need for this in his 1916 address. The Assembly of 1916 followed his suggestion and authorized the appointment of 12 to 70 elders. It ended up being 12 on the board of elders. An amendment ruled that the general overseer would appoint the first 2 members, and the other 10 would be selected by those first 3. Their primary role as the cabinet included answering questions from members. So whereas that used to just be Brother Tomlinson, they would now be a part of it, but it also was going to give them some authority, is what ends up happening. His intention was just that they would advise him when there were issues that needed to be settled, but there was a loophole in the way it was worded that was going to be taken advantage of. In 1917, Tomlinson appointed F.J. Lee and T.L. McLean as the first two, and these selected the other 10. In 1920, the General Assembly granted for the GO to replace any elder when there was a vacancy. And specifically, it was worded that he could replace someone in the cases of death or disloyalty. It is interesting when you read the diaries of Brother Tomlinson and you read the minutes of his addresses, where he was really wringing his hands over the whole thing. He felt very concerned that he do the right thing. And he was worried. He was under this weight, this burden of the church. Everything had been on his shoulders this whole time. But he was very worried that he was going to do something that would not be in full line with what God wanted for the church. So he even makes comments that you can hear the doubt in his words of, I hope this is the right thing. I pray this is the right thing. And in the end, I don't know how much debate we want to put into it, whether or not it was, or whether or not it was a matter of the execution where it all fell apart. But what we do know is that with that board of elders, these new advisors, it was ushering in a change to the way that the church was envisioned. So again, we were supposed to be a theocracy. We were not supposed to be a democracy. I've given you all of these governmental terms to help you to understand, but the church was not supposed to be like the government. The church is not supposed to be like anything else. And yet, here we are now having conversations that are equating the general overseer to a president and the president's cabinet. Well, the next natural step, which is what the elders wanted, pushed for, and got, was a constitution. The precursor to the Constitution was a declaration in the 15th Assembly. This is in 1920. This was a stepping stone to the split due to phrases such as, that the General Assembly of the Church of God is that organized body with full power and authority to designate the teaching, government principles, and practices of all local churches composing said assembly, and statements that the General Assembly promulgates rules. To, quote, promulgate rules and regulations meant the General Assembly, through this declaration, has now become a legislative body. And to, quote, provide a general government in which is vested full power and authority to dictate and to govern local churches made the General Assembly an executive body. So suddenly, what was always supposed to be judicial is now all three parts of a government. And what ends up happening is that we do indeed have an oligarchy. What happens next is that Brother Tomlinson ends up adding more elders. So you had those board of elders, the 12, and then he's going to add what was called the courts of justice. The 1921 General Overseer's address recommended the institution of courts of justice, which had been discussed by some for a while. The courts of justice would include those 12 cabinet members, plus 70 more elders, equaling 82 elders. They would deliberate on questions and rule in disputes. So the courts of justice could answer questions which came up, but they could also handle issues, for instance, between members or between churches or between a member and the pastor or between a state office later on and individual churches. And it was patterned like the courts that we have in our government. And so with that, we now have an oligarchy, fully, because they have been deemed the official assembly, which could meet at any time, any place, anywhere, and it had full power and authority to designate rules of government, teachings, principles for the local church. So these elders, where everything had said before, we went from the assembly is judicial to now the assembly is all three, but also the assembly is no longer the assembly of all the members. The assembly, the official assembly, is this group of elders who have been appointed, and they can come together, be brought together whenever they need to make decisions. So now all the power which should only be in the hands of God, all the power is now placed in these elders' hands. M.S. Lemons preached a message the next day at that assembly on the subject, where he explained why the specific number of 70 was used and why this was such a great thing that they were about to embark on. That was another thing about the assemblies. Generally, the overseer would bring up a subject or a change that was going to happen, and then there would be some person who was selected as a capable speaker who would essentially present it to the assembly to try to get people on board. The Courts of Justice vote was approved in the 1921 assembly. Also in the 1921 assembly, that church constitution was officially adopted. Now, I'm not going to read this lengthy constitution to you, but I do want to share about a few remarks which were made by the general overseer in the assembly before he brought up this constitution. He said that the elders in council with the general overseer had concluded that there was a need of a constitution for the church of God. So the elders, we see it here, with the general overseer, had all made this decision that there now needs to be a constitution. The constitution was said to have been written by that group together. Now, bear that in your mind as I read to you one section of special note. This is Article 4, Section 10. The term of all officials shall be fixed by the General Assembly while in session. Section 11, any official is subject to impeachment for an offense rendering him unworthy of the position that he occupies. Now, why is that important? Again, it was written, pushed for by those elders and written by the elders with the general overseer. But what is notable about that is that in the 10th Assembly in 1914, the office of general overseer for Brother Tomlinson had been made permanent. It was supposed to be a lifelong appointment because they felt the Holy Spirit had spoken and said, this is who needs to remain in this office. Well, then they add in this part that basically is saying nobody's above impeachment. Any role, we can decide that it needs to end. And so there are some historians who feel like that was a very specific move that was made by those elders because they were preparing the way in case it was time to remove Brother Tomlinson, which is where we are headed next. So it is now obvious that there is a difference of opinion because once the elders get on board, we see Brother Tomlinson did go along with it, but again, you can read his words and see how much trepidation he had over what they were doing. He very quickly saw the error of instituting the Constitution, but it was too late by then. But we can see that the elders saw things very differently than Brother Tomlinson did, and presumably different than what a lot of church members felt should have happened, because we have now totally left this idea that we are a theocratic movement, that we are ruled by God, that we trust the Holy Spirit's going to put us all on the same page and we all need to be on the same page. And now everything has shifted about the way things are going to be run. And also, we don't just have one man whom the assembly already felt the Holy Spirit had put a stamp of lifetime approval on. Now we're saying he can't make the decisions. This entire group of men, which has just expanded again. Now, I'm not saying this was forced on Brother Tomlinson because he had to go along with it. However, you can read the sorrowful words where he later realizes, again, the errors that he made along the way. That takes us to our third potential cause of this split, allegations of misappropriation. In 1920, a new financial system began in which all churches tithed to headquarters. At that point, the general overseer and the elders would plan distribution of the money. This system was put into practice, and it was very difficult to put into practice. Adding to the difficulty was that by 1921, the church was under heavy debt. I'm going to give you 4 reasons that I know of that contributed to the debt. Number 1 was the building of a new auditorium. This auditorium, built in Cleveland, Tennessee, could seat 4,000 people. The construction cost was approximately $40,000. In today's money, that's around $675,000. This auditorium would be used for the assemblies, and it was an important piece of property. However, they did have to take out a hefty loan to be able to build it. The second major factor, which is listed historically, was the launch of a new orphanage, a children's home in Cleveland, which was in that same part of town. The orphanage, what's interesting is that when you read the actual published balance sheets, you read the accounting documents, what you see, at least for a while, was that oftentimes that auditorium and the orphanage were put together as a line item. And so I am a little bit curious about that. I would like to see more details on it, because I don't know if that's just because they were just factoring the buildings, because you can see there was continual deficit on that auditorium account when they later on started splitting them apart, but money was often coming in through offerings for the orphanage. But of course, there's much more to an orphanage, or a children's home as it was called, than just the building. You're going to have the means to feed the children. You're going to have clothing for the children. There's all sorts of things that could factor in that perhaps I just haven't seen, but it is interesting because those two get tied together in the books often. But it is very clear that $40,000 note was what was hanging over their heads. The third cause of great debt was the printing press and its expenses. The first issue of the Church of God paper was called the Evening Light and Church of God Evangel. It was printed on March 10th, 1910. The first printing office and publishing house was built in Cleveland in the spring of 1913. And F.J. Lee was named the chairman of the publishing company. Brother Thomason had been editor, but F.J. Lee was the chairman of that company. Remember his name, it's going to come up again. By 1919, 16,500 evangel papers were being circulated. That required more space and equipment, which had been authorized to build and to purchase when there was no money clearly available for that building. It just was important that they get the message out. It was important to get the gospel out, and they were sort of living by faith in that moment. The reason the fourth factor matters is probably a little bit more plain to those of us who led a church in recent years. I started pastoring here in February of 2020, and so portions I've read on this next one really hit home to me. The world events of 1918 had put the church in quite a bind. World War I ended in November of 1918. However, there was another world event that was still pressing heavy on the church. It was the pandemic of influenza. Because of the influenza pandemic, the 1918 assembly was postponed, which contributed to it being hard to meet expenses because now people were not coming to the assembly to bring those offerings. Also, remember that financial structure. People would tithe to the local church, and then the money was sent up to headquarters. Well, if you can't have church because there's a pandemic, then there's not tithe coming in to send up. When we had our pandemic, at least we had easy tithe, and we were able to mail checks of tithe in. And so we were still able to sustain the bills of the church. Most churches were. I hope most churches. I don't have a statistic on that, but we had those sort of things coming in. They didn't have any of that. So if you didn't have church, you weren't getting money in to send off. That became a major issue. But like the pandemic we came through, another factor in keeping up the expenses of the church comes down to if the members aren't making any money, they don't have anything to tithe. And so all of these factors come in together. We're carrying these huge property notes. We're carrying these big expenses from the publishing house. We're carrying the expense of these orphanages. And by the way, don't you think that the needs of the orphanages was probably expanding in that same time when so many people were dying from influenza? So all this stuff is just sort of an avalanche that's falling in around the same time. So we've got high expenses and not as much income. And that is when questions begin to be brought up about finances. Now, I've been around church my whole life, and I have been in different types of churches, and I read a lot about other churches, and this is not uncommon, that when there seems to be a disconnect, that people begin to ask questions, and it's right to ask questions. These questions seem a little bit different than the ones that normally are brought up in good faith. J.S. Llewellyn had been one of the primary names who was helping Brother Tomlinson. He requested a committee to investigate the finances, as there were now some questions. That committee included Llewellyn, F.J. Lee, and J.B. Ellis. An auditor from Chattanooga was brought in who prepared a, quote, preliminary examination of the books on file. Now, the phrasing of that is really important. The word preliminary specifically is important. I used to work in healthcare. I was a CT tech. I did x-rays and CAT scans. A preliminary report meant it was not finalized, it was not signed, we were not allowed to use that as an official diagnosis. That could not be considered the final word. The same is true of this auditor's report, that it can't be the final answer. And also, it says of the books on file. See, he didn't have all the books. And because he didn't have all the books, the audit wasn't actually complete. He came up with a shortage of $14,141.83. And it had to be placed somewhere in the documents to offset the notes payable, so it was charged to A.J. Tomlinson. Now, here's another thing you need to know about the structure and the way things ran. The general overseer was essentially considered the chief treasurer of the church because that money was coming into Cleveland and then he would have to send it back out. The general overseer had the right to, quote, borrow money from one fund for another. I really hate that word that they're using because it sounds like when somebody, quote unquote, borrows from church money and then they abscond with it. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about what churches all over do, which is, for example, if you need more money in your children's fund, it may get moved from a general expense account over to the children's fund. That is not abnormal. That's what he was authorized to be able to do. So when the notes for that auditorium and other headquarters holdings became a problem because they were coming due, Tomlinson had used, quote, some of the tithes that belonged to the preachers on the field a little at a time, hoping to get in enough funds to reimburse the ministers. If you want to read up on that, it's in Upon This Rock, Volume 1. He did this specifically to avoid foreclosure and bankruptcy. But the money he thought would come in where he could repay that minister's account never came in. So Brother Tomlinson was thinking, well, this is due right now. We can just move money from this fund over here to pay this. And then when more money is coming in through the publishing house, or if money is coming in through these drives where we're raising money, or the tithe is coming from the churches, then we can replenish the minister's accounts before we have to pay it. But then they didn't get enough to carry out that plan. Now, if we were doing this on a personal level, this is a little bit like if you follow the envelope system of budgeting. That's the one Dave Ramsey promotes. And you have money in your different envelopes to pay your bills. And the light bill comes in and it was $100 more than you expected and it's due right now. Well, I'm going to borrow $100 out of the envelope for my gas bill, and I'm going to put that in here and I'm going to use that right now, and then when I get another $100 I'll put that money in there. Eventually it does often catch up to us. It's not something that you would want to be doing. It's not something you hope to do. You hope you can avoid that. But essentially that was the mindset, and money was going to come in and then he could replenish that. Whether or not it was wise, whether or not he should have done it that way, I'm not debating that. But I do believe everything that I have read and I have seen of the character of Brother Tomlinson tells me that there was never anything malicious in it. And he was not making any sort of personal gain in it. He was truly burdened for, we have to save the publishing house. We need to save the holdings. We don't want to lose these things that we have. Remember this, we're not just talking about a building going away. If the publishing house got foreclosed on, those employees don't have jobs. If the orphanage gets foreclosed on, where are those kids going to go? It's more complex and it makes more sense than it may appear on paper why he would do this. He thought this would work and it just didn't. So when the money didn't come in, he tearfully explained to the board and later the assembly what had happened. And he promised ministers who were shorted that they were going to be repaid. But what ended up happening was that most of them said that just consider it a donation. I don't need to be repaid when the money comes in. There are actually records of this. And the ministers who did not receive their full disbursement like they were supposed to, they had to send in letters were sent back and forth to let them know what was going on and a promise of you will be paid when we receive money in. But most of them wrote back and said, I don't want it, consider it for the cause, that's fine. What is really interesting is that in 1922, Brother Tomlinson explained to the assembly that he had actually borrowed $6,000 in his own name to try to avoid what all happened. So he had actually gone to the bank and in his name, not in the church's name, but in his name, he had taken out $6,000 hoping that he could use that and that was going to fix this, and it didn't. And the reason he brought that up is because now he's being accused, well, there's $14,000 missing, somebody's responsible, and it's your fault. And because it got laid on his name, because there weren't all the books available for the auditor was not done, but it looks like he took that money. Tomlinson brings this up in the assembly and says, I put $6,000 in of my own money to try to make things right, to try to fix this before it came to this whole mess. And I'm not getting my $6,000 back, which $6,000 is a lot of money to me right now. Imagine then. He says, I'm not getting that money back. And there is no minister in this church who was shorted the amount of money that I am now out. And the purpose of that, the point of that was him saying, obviously, I wasn't trying to get rich because this has cost me money too. It did not benefit him at all in the end. But this opens up the door for accusation, and it opens up the door for, depending whose books you read, a coup. If you read someone else's historical books, they might say it opened the door for justice to be served. That's the part we're getting to next week. But today we leave with a letter which was sent by 4 members of that elder board to Brother Tomlinson, dated March 28, 1921. The letter reads, we, the undersigned members of the Board of Elders, respectfully request you to call a meeting of the Board of Elders at the earliest convenience for the consideration of important matters that may be brought before them. We do this on account of the deep concern that we have for the welfare of the church and in view of the fact that there is a growing and widespread dissatisfaction on account of some recent developments of vital interest to the church. Some of our practices and customs are seriously questioned from a legal standpoint, and the general interest of the church demands adjustment of matters in question. Respectfully submitted, signed M.S. Lemons, J.B. Ellis, T.L. McLean, and J.S. Llewellyn. When we return, we'll discuss what happened next with that board, what happened with those allegations, and how it all led to the church splitting. But as we leave, I want to read to you an excerpt from Brother Tomlinson's personal diary. This was from 1921 in September, so a few months after that letter was written. And I want you to hear the burden that was on him, because I want you to understand we can look in retrospect and we can see signs and we can see that the issue with the elders was going to be a problem. But listen to the burden that was on him and see if you can understand why he would welcome in the help and then think what it felt like when those you thought were there to help you, something shifted. Tomlinson writes, the past has been the hardest year of my life in many respects. Since the assembly, I have filled the place of general overseer of all the churches, distributed the money to the ministers since January 1 this year, editor and publisher of the Evangel, business manager of the publishing house, superintendent of the Bible training school, both the homeschool and by correspondence. Preached a lot of funerals, performed a number of marriage ceremonies, started and superintended the orphanage and children's home, financed the debt on the auditorium, preached a number of times for the pastor when he was sick or gone, superintendent of the Sunday school, which has grown up to 313 last Sunday. I've worked on an average of 18 hours a day, and then I feel that I'm falling behind all the time. In the office and publishing house, I employ from 26 to 30 employees all the time. Payroll is from 400 to 500 a week. The strain has been intense, often more than I could stand, but for the grace of God and the strength He imparts. The council is to meet the 20th of this month, and the Bible school opens the 26th. Then in November comes the assembly. I've instituted and directed a number of city Sunday school drives and one tremendous orphanage drive, besides overseeing BTS drives for students and preparing dormitory and school room for them. I will be 56 years old this month, and the work and the responsibility is increasing. How much this man was doing, the burden that he felt on him, what it must have felt like when those who were supposed to come and help suddenly are questioning motives and questioning actions and doubting that this person is capable to lead, when he had already led this movement from a couple handfuls of people all the way up to, by this point in history, we're now nearing 20,000 members. What must it have felt like? We'll find out when we come back next week. Thank you for joining me for Little Notes and Big Questions. Make sure you like, subscribe. Don't miss any notifications for the next video we'll have up next week. See you then.